The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's downtown streets as Officer James Wilson adjusted his police badge in the rearview mirror of his patrol car. At 42, he had served on the force for 15 years, and like many of his colleagues, he believed he knew this city better than most. The date was September 15th, and the air buzzed with tension. Social media had been flooded with announcements about a major civil rights rally planned for that afternoon. Officer Wilson had been assigned to monitor the event, along with several other officers from the precinct. Another day, another protest, he muttered to himself, sipping coffee from his thermos. Over the past few months, Millbrook had seen an increase in demonstrations, each one larger than the last. The police department was on edge, especially after recent incidents in neighboring cities had made national headlines. As Wilson drove toward the rally location at Central Park, he noticed small groups of people walking in the same direction, carrying rolled-up banners and handmade signs. The crowd was growing steadily, and by noon, the park was filled with hundreds of voices chanting in unison. Among the protesters stood Marcus Thompson, a 35-year-old community organizer known for his work in Millbrook's underprivileged neighborhoods. With his law degree from State University and 6 years of experience on the city council, Marcus had earned respect from many residents. Today, he wore a simple blue button-down shirt and khaki pants, choosing to look professional despite the summer heat. Officer Wilson watched from his position near the park entrance as Marcus took the makeshift stage, a small platform assembled that morning. The crowd fell silent as Marcus adjusted the microphone. "We are here today not to divide, but to unite," Marcus began, his voice clear and steady. "Millbrook can be better. Millbrook must be better. And we are the ones who will make that change happen." The crowd responded with enthusiastic applause. Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably, noticing how people were recording everything on their phones. He never liked being filmed while doing his job. As Marcus continued his speech, addressing police accountability and community relations, Wilson noticed a small group of counter-protesters arriving at the edge of the park. Their presence immediately created ripples of tension through the crowd. Keep it peaceful, Marcus urged from the stage, raising his hands when he noticed the situation. He stepped down and walked toward the area where the groups were beginning to clash, hoping to de-escalate the situation. Officer Wilson also moved closer, his hand resting instinctively on his belt. The air felt electric with tension as Marcus positioned himself between the two groups, speaking calmly to both sides. "This is not what we're here for," Marcus said firmly. "We can disagree without becoming violent." But Officer Wilson had already made his decision. In his view, Marcus was interfering with police business by inserting himself into the situation. Without warning, he stepped forward and grabbed Marcus's arm. "You're under arrest for disturbing the peace," Wilson announced loudly, pulling Marcus's hands behind his back. The crowd erupted in shocked gasps and angry shouts. Dozens of phones were raised, recording the incident from every angle. Marcus didn't resist, but his voice was clear and steady as he spoke. "I have the right to peacefully protest," he said, looking directly into a nearby camera. "I have broken no laws." Officer Wilson tightened the handcuffs, perhaps with more force than necessary. The look in his eyes suggested he was enjoying this moment of authority, not realizing he was creating a pivotal moment in Millbrook's history. As Wilson led Marcus to the patrol car, the crowd's chants grew louder. Several people followed, still recording, their phones capturing every detail of the arrest. Marcus maintained his dignity, walking calmly despite the tight handcuffs and rough treatment. Back at the station, Wilson filled out the arrest report with practiced efficiency, checking the boxes for disturbing the peace and interfering with police business. He didn't know that one of the videos of the arrest was already going viral on social media, or that local news stations were preparing to lead their evening broadcasts with the story. As Marcus sat in the holding cell, he closed his eyes and took deep breaths. This wasn't the first time he'd witnessed abuse of power, but it was the first time he'd experienced it so personally. In that moment, as the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, something shifted in his mind. This arrest wouldn't be the end of his story. It would be the beginning of something much bigger. Little did Officer Wilson know that his actions that day would set in motion a chain of events that would transform Millbrook forever. The video of Marcus Thompson's arrest spread like wildfire across social media platforms. By the next morning, Every major news outlet in Millbrook had picked up the story. The footage clearly showed Marcus attempting to prevent violence, making Officer Wilson's actions appear not just unnecessary, but deliberately hostile. Sarah Chen, a local news reporter, stood outside the police station where crowds had gathered demanding Marcus's release. Her live broadcast captured the growing anger in the community. Behind me, hundreds of citizens have assembled to protest yesterday's arrest of Marcus Thompson, she reported, gesturing to the crowd. Sources tell us this isn't the first time Officer James Wilson has been involved in controversial arrests. Inside the station, Police Chief Robert Martinez watched the coverage with growing concern. He'd known Wilson for years and had previously dismissed complaints about the officer as routine friction between police and civilians. But this time was different. The evidence was too clear, the public reaction too strong to ignore. "Get me Thompson's file," he ordered his secretary, "and Wilson's disciplinary record." While the chief reviewed the documents, Marcus was being released from custody. His lawyer, Diana Rodriguez, stood beside him as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Marcus straightened his wrinkled shirt and faced the media with calm dignity. "What happened yesterday wasn't just about me," he said, his voice steady. "It's about a pattern of behavior that needs to change. I've seen it as a city council member, and now I've experienced it firsthand." The crowd cheered as Marcus continued. "For years, we tried to work within the system. We filed complaints, attended meetings, proposed reforms, but nothing changes. Maybe it's time for new leadership in Millbrook." These words sent ripples through the crowd. Several people began chanting, "Thompson for mayor, Thompson for mayor." Meanwhile, Officer Wilson sat in his living room, watching the news coverage with growing anger. His wife, Karen, stood in the doorway, worried about her husband's mounting frustration. "They're making me look like the bad guy," Wilson muttered, changing channels only to find the same story everywhere. "I was just doing my job." Back at City Hall, current Mayor Richard Green called an emergency meeting with his staff. The polling numbers on his desk showed his approval rating dropping sharply after the incident. His re-election, once considered certain, now seemed in jeopardy. "We need to get ahead of this," his campaign manager advised. "The video doesn't look good, James. We either distance ourselves from Wilson or risk going down with him." As the day progressed, more videos emerged. Security footage from previous incidents involving Officer Wilson surfaced, showing a pattern of aggressive behavior, particularly toward minorities. Local activists began compiling statistics, revealing disturbing trends in arrest rates and use of force. Community leaders gathered at the First Baptist Church, where Reverend Michael Jackson had known Marcus since childhood. The church basement was packed with concerned citizens, all discussing the previous day's events. "This is our moment," Reverend Jackson announced. "Marcus has always fought for what's right. Maybe this is God's way of showing us who should really be leading our city." In his modest apartment, Marcus sat with his sister Angela, considering his next move. The walls were covered with community service awards and his law degree. Angela scrolled through her phone, reading messages of support pouring in from across the city. "The people are ready for change," Angela said softly. "And they trust you, Marcus." Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city he'd served for so many years. The lights of downtown Millbrook twinkled in the distance, and he could see the police station where he'd spent the previous night in a cell. "If I run for mayor," he said slowly, "it can't be about revenge. It has to be about making real change." Angela smiled, already pulling up campaign information on her laptop. "The filing deadline for candidates is next week. We better get started." As night fell over Millbrook, the story continued to gain traction. National news networks picked up the footage, and civil rights organizations began reaching out to Marcus. Social media hashtags trended, and ordinary citizens shared their own stories of encounters with Officer Wilson and the police department. The incident had sparked something larger than anyone expected. What started as a routine arrest at a rally was becoming a catalyst for change in Millbrook. The next few weeks would test the city's character, reveal hidden truths, and ultimately transform its future in ways nobody could have predicted. The stage was set for a political battle that would change Millbrook forever. Marcus Thompson's campaign headquarters buzzed with activity in a converted storefront downtown. Just 3 weeks after his arrest, Supporters had transformed the empty space into a hub of political energy. Angela, now serving as her brother's campaign manager, stood at a whiteboard mapping out their strategy. "We're focusing on three main issues," she explained to the volunteers: police reform, economic development, and community unity. Across town, Officer Wilson patrolled his usual route, trying to ignore the hostile stares from residents who recognized him from the viral video. His supervisor had assigned him to desk duty initially, but Wilson had fought against it, insisting on maintaining his regular patrol. "I won't let them make me hide," he told his partner, though the strain showed in his voice. Every time he made a traffic stop now, people recorded him on their phones. Marcus's first major campaign speech drew a crowd that surprised even his supporters. The community center's parking lot overflowed, and people stood in the aisles to hear him speak. He had chosen this venue deliberately. It was just 2 blocks from where he'd been arrested. "I stand before you not as a victim," Marcus began, his voice strong and clear, "but as someone who has seen both sides of our city's struggles. I've served on the city council, worked as a community organizer, and yes, I've experienced injustice firsthand. But this campaign isn't about one incident or one officer. It's about building a better Millbrook for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause. In the back of the room, several police officers listened quietly. Not everyone on the force supported Wilson's actions, and some saw Marcus's campaign as a chance for necessary change. Mayor Green's response to the growing movement was to announce a series of police reform measures, but many viewed them as too little, too late. His polling numbers continued to drop as Marcus's campaign gained momentum. Local business owners began displaying "Thompson for Mayor" signs in their windows. Even some longtime supporters of Mayor Green switched allegiances, impressed by Marcus's message of unity and reform rather than division and revenge. One afternoon, as Marcus walked through his old neighborhood meeting voters, he encountered Officer Wilson's wife, Karen, at the grocery store. The moment could have been awkward, but Marcus handled it with characteristic grace. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, nodding politely, "I hope you're doing well." Karen hesitated before responding. "My husband. He's not a bad person," she said quietly. Marcus looked at her thoughtfully. "I believe that. This isn't about good people or bad people. It's about creating a system that works for everyone." The exchange was overheard by other shoppers, and soon the story of Marcus's compassionate response spread through social media, adding another dimension to his campaign. As the race intensified, Marcus focused on detailed policy proposals. He worked late into the night with his team, developing plans for police oversight, community investment, and economic development. His law background proved invaluable as he crafted specific, actionable reforms. "We need to be ready to implement changes from day one," he told his staff. "People are counting on us to deliver real results, not just promises." The local newspaper's editorial board, initially skeptical of Marcus's candidacy, published a lengthy analysis of his proposals. Their conclusion surprised many. "Thompson's platform represents the most comprehensive and realistic plan for reform we've seen in decades." Meanwhile, Officer Wilson faced mounting pressure at work. Internal Affairs had reopened investigations into previous complaints against him, and fellow officers began distancing themselves. The union still supported him publicly, but privately, many questioned whether defending him was worth the cost to department morale. One evening, as Marcus left a campaign event, he found a note on his car. It was from a retired police sergeant. "Mr. Thompson, not all of us wear the badge the way Wilson does. Some of us want change too. You have my vote." The message reinforced Marcus's conviction that his campaign needed to bridge divides, not deepen them. At his next rally, he invited current and former police officers to stand with him on stage. "Reform doesn't mean rejection," he declared. "It means working together to build something better. When I become mayor, every officer who serves with honor will have my full support, and those who abuse their power will be held accountable." As autumn approached and the election drew nearer, Millbrook felt the electricity of real change in the air. Marcus's campaign had evolved from a response to injustice into a movement for transformation, and even his opponents had to admit something extraordinary was happening in their city. As the mayoral campaign entered its crucial phase, Officer James Wilson's life had become increasingly uncomfortable. The whispers in the police station hallways grew louder, and the sideways glances from his colleagues more frequent. Even routine paperwork was now scrutinized with unusual. One morning, Captain Rodriguez called Wilson into his office. The blinds were drawn, and the captain's expression was grave. "James, we need to talk about these newly surfaced complaints," Rodriguez said, gesturing to a thick folder on his desk. "Internal Affairs has found some concerning patterns." Wilson shifted in his chair, his face reddening. "Those are all standard procedures, Captain. I've never violated department policy." "The video evidence suggests otherwise," Rodriguez replied quietly. "We have 3 new witnesses who've come forward about incidents from last year." Outside the station, Marcus Thompson's campaign continued gaining momentum. His team had set up mobile registration stations in neighborhoods that historically had low voter turnout. The strategy was working. Voter registration numbers were breaking records. Local businesses began feeling the impact of the changing political climate. At Rosie's Diner, a popular breakfast spot for police officers, owner Rose Martinez noticed the division among her customers. "Some officers come in supporting Thompson now," she told her regular customers. "Others won't even sit at the same counter with them. In 30 years of running this place, I'd never seen the force so split." Wilson tried to maintain his normal routine, but it became increasingly difficult. One day, while buying coffee, the barista refused to serve him. Another time, he found his patrol car covered with sticky notes bearing messages like "accountability now" and "badge immunity." At home, the strain showed on his family. His teenage daughter came home crying after classmates shared memes about her father. His wife Karen stopped attending church, tired of the uncomfortable silences when she entered the room. "Maybe you should take a leave of absence," Karen suggested one evening, "just until the election is over." Wilson slammed his fist on the table. "That would be admitting guilt. I did nothing wrong." Meanwhile, Marcus's campaign faced its own challenges. Death threats began arriving at his headquarters, requiring increased security measures. Some of his supporters experienced vandalism of their homes and businesses. But rather than let these incidents divide the city further, Marcus used them to reinforce his message of unity. At a town hall meeting, he addressed the issues directly. "Violence and intimidation have no place in Millbrook," he declared. "Whether it's from someone wearing a badge or someone opposing them, we must be better than this." The statement earned him respect from moderate voters who had been uncertain about his stance on law enforcement. Even some veteran officers began quietly expressing support for his campaign. One such officer was Sarah Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the force. She approached Marcus after a campaign event. "I've worked with Wilson," she said. "What happened at the rally? It wasn't an isolated incident. Many of us have wanted to speak up, but the culture of silence is strong." Her testimony, along with others, became part of the growing internal affairs investigation. Wilson found himself spending more time meeting with union representatives and lawyers than patrolling the streets. The mayor's office, sensing the shifting tide, began distancing itself from Wilson. Mayor Green's office released a statement promising a complete review of departmental policies, but carefully avoided mentioning Wilson by name. One rainy afternoon, Wilson sat in his patrol car, watching protesters march past with signs bearing Marcus's campaign slogans. A young boy stopped and stared at him through the window. There was no anger in the child's eyes, just curiosity and perhaps a hint of sadness. That moment stuck with Wilson. For the first time, he began to question his actions, not just at the rally but throughout his career. Had he become the very thing he'd sworn to fight against when he first put on the badge? Back at campaign headquarters, Marcus reviewed the latest polling numbers with his team. Their message was resonating across all demographics, but he remained focused on the bigger picture. "Winning the election is just the beginning," he reminded his staff. "The real work starts after that. We need to heal this city." As October drew to a close, both Wilson and Marcus knew that change was coming to Millbrook. For one man, it meant facing the consequences of years of unchecked authority. For the other, it meant shouldering the responsibility of transforming a divided city into a united community. The election was just weeks away, and Millbrook held its breath, waiting to see how this chapter of its history would end. With just 2 weeks until Election Day, Millbrook was transforming. Campaign posters covered nearly every storefront, and conversations in coffee shops, parks, and workplaces all centered on the upcoming vote. The local news stations ran constant updates on the mayoral race, which had now attracted national attention. Marcus Thompson's campaign headquarters moved to a larger office to accommodate the growing number of volunteers. The walls were covered with maps showing voter districts, and dozens of people worked phones and computers. The latest polls show us leading by 8 points, Angela told Marcus as they reviewed strategy. But we can't get comfortable. Remember what happened in the last election. Across town, Officer Wilson faced a different kind of pressure. Internal Affairs had completed their preliminary investigation, and the results weren't good. Captain Rodriguez called Wilson into his office early one morning. "We've uncovered 17 incidents over the past 3 years," Rodriguez explained, sliding a document across his desk. "Excessive force complaints, racial profiling allegations, and questionable arrests. The evidence is substantial." Wilson stared at the paper, his hands trembling slightly. "You're suspending me?" "Paid administrative leave, pending the final investigation," Rodriguez replied. "Turn in your badge and gun before you leave today." The news of Wilson's suspension spread quickly through the department. Some officers expressed relief, while others worried they might be next. The police union called an emergency meeting to discuss their position. Meanwhile, Marcus's campaign received an unexpected boost. A group of retired police officers, led by former Chief Michael Davidson, publicly endorsed his candidacy. "We need leadership that understands both law enforcement and community needs," Davidson announced at a press conference. "Marcus Thompson has demonstrated that understanding. He's not anti-police, he's anti-abuse of power. There's a crucial difference." The endorsement sent shockwaves through the political landscape. Mayor Green's campaign scrambled to respond, but their messages seemed hollow compared to the authentic connection Marcus had built with the community. Wilson watched these developments from home, growing more isolated each day. His wife Karen found him one evening staring at old photographs from his police academy graduation. "I wanted to be one of the good ones," he said quietly. "When did I lose my way?" Karen sat beside him, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Maybe it's not too late to make things right." Back on the campaign trail, Marcus focused on unity. At a major rally in the city park, the same location where he'd been arrested, he addressed a crowd of thousands. "Looking out at all of you today, I see the real Millbrook," he declared. "People of all backgrounds coming together for positive change. We're not here to tear down the police department. We're here to build a better one. We're not here to divide our city. We're here to unite it." The crowd's response was electric. Even some of Wilson's former supporters were present, wearing Thompson for Change buttons. One of the most powerful moments came when Officer Sarah Martinez, still in uniform, took the stage to speak. "I've worn this badge for 20 years, she said. "And I can tell you that good police officers want accountability. We want trust. We want the community to see us as guardians, not warriors." Marcus Thompson understands this. As Election Day drew closer, the Internal Affairs investigation into Wilson revealed more troubling details. Several officers came forward with testimonies about witnessing inappropriate behavior but feeling pressured to stay quiet. The police chief held a press conference to address the findings. "We are committed to transparency and accountability," he stated. "The actions of one officer do not reflect the values of our entire department." Wilson watched the press conference on TV, seeing his 20-year career crumbling before his eyes. For the first time, he began to understand the true impact of his actions. Marcus's campaign received the news with dignity. Rather than celebrating Wilson's downfall, Marcus used it as an opportunity to discuss meaningful reform. "This isn't about one person," he reminded his staff. "It's about creating a system where everyone is treated with respect and dignity, where power comes with responsibility and justice is truly blind." As the sun set on another day in Millbrook, both men reflected on how their paths had crossed and diverged. Wilson sat alone in his house, confronting the consequences of his choices, while Marcus stood before another crowd, sharing his vision for a better future. The election was just days away, and the city stood on the brink of historic change. The question wasn't just who would win, but how Millbrook would heal and move forward together. Election Day dawned clear and crisp in Millbrook. Long lines formed outside polling stations before the sun had fully risen. Elderly voters told reporters they'd never seen such high turnout, even during presidential elections. Marcus Thompson arrived at his local polling place early, accompanied by his sister Angela. News cameras captured him waiting patiently in line like any other citizen. When it was his turn, he paused briefly before casting his ballot. "I said a little prayer," he later told reporters, "not for victory, but for our city's healing." Across town, Officer Wilson also voted, slipping quietly into his precinct during a lull in the crowd. Some people recognized him and whispered, but no one confronted him. The past few weeks of suspension had aged him visibly, his hair grayer, his shoulders more hunched. Throughout the day, reports of record-breaking voter turnout kept coming in. The city clerk's office had to request additional ballots for several precincts. Young voters, many participating in their first election, posted proudly about their "I voted" stickers on social media. At campaign headquarters, Marcus's team monitored the situation closely. Volunteers reported from every district, tracking turnout and responding to voters' questions. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. "Exit polls are looking strong," Angela told Marcus as they watched the numbers come in. "But we've seen surprises before." Mayor Green's campaign office presented a stark contrast. Staff members packed boxes and took down posters early, reading the writing on the wall. The incumbent mayor had already prepared 2 speeches, one for victory and one for concession. As polls closed at 8 p.m., the city held its breath. News teams set up their equipment in the hotel ballroom where Marcus's campaign planned to gather. Supporters began filling the space, many wearing campaign t-shirts and carrying homemade signs. The first results started trickling in around 9 p.m. Marcus watched from a private room with his closest advisors as the numbers appeared on multiple screens. District by district, the pattern became clear. At 10:15 p.m., the major networks made their projection. Marcus Thompson would be the next mayor of Millbrook. The ballroom erupted in cheers and tears of joy. People hugged strangers, danced, and chanted his name. At 10:30 p.m., Mayor Green called Marcus to concede. Their conversation was brief but civil. "The people have spoken," Green said. "I wish you success in healing our city." Marcus took the stage at 11 p.m. to deliver his victory speech. The room fell silent as he approached the microphone. His voice was steady and clear, though his eyes glistened with emotion. "Tonight, Millbrook chose hope over fear," he began. "Unity over division. Progress over the status quo. But this victory belongs not to me, but to every citizen who believed change was possible." He then addressed the police department directly. "To our officers who serve with honor and integrity, you are essential partners in building a better Millbrook. Reform doesn't mean rejection. It means creating a department that better serves both its officers and its community." In his living room, Wilson watched the speech with his wife. Karen saw tears in his eyes when Marcus spoke about accountability and redemption. The final numbers showed Marcus winning by 15 percentage points, a landslide in local politics. He had carried every district except one, including several that had never before voted for a progressive candidate. As midnight approached, Marcus stood at the hotel window, looking out over the city he would soon lead. The streets below were filled with celebrating citizens. Cars honked their horns, and people danced on sidewalks. Angela joined him at the window. "Remember when we were kids," she said, "and you told Mom you wanted to change the world?" Marcus smiled. "This is just the beginning," he replied. "The real work starts tomorrow." Across Millbrook, people celebrated in different ways. At the First Baptist Church, Reverend Jackson led a prayer service of thanksgiving. At Rosie's Diner, police officers and civilians shared coffee and conversation, discussing the future with cautious optimism. The local newspaper had already prepared their headline for the morning edition: "Historic VICTORY, Thompson elected mayor in landslide." As the celebration continued into the night, Marcus excused himself from the ballroom. He needed a moment alone to process everything. In the quiet of his temporary office, he looked at a photo on his phone, the image of him being arrested by Officer Wilson just months ago. "Everything happens for a reason," he whispered to himself, then turned off his phone and rejoined the celebration. The city of Millbrook had turned a page in its history. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, Hope filled the air like electricity. The first month of Mayor Marcus Thompson's administration moved at a dizzying pace. His transition team worked long hours, reviewing department policies and preparing for the changes ahead. The mayor's office, once filled with traditional dark wood furniture, now buzzed with energy and new. On a cold morning in January, Marcus sat at his desk reviewing Officer Wilson's complete personnel file. The thick folder contained 20 years of service records, complaints, and the recent internal affairs investigation findings. "It's worse than we thought," said Police Chief Martinez, who had been appointed by Marcus to lead the department's reformation. "The pattern of misconduct goes back years. Previous administrations buried many complaints." Marcus rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the decision before him. "Have you spoken with the city attorney?" "Yes," Martinez replied. "We have more than enough grounds for termination. The question is timing and approach." Across town, Wilson spent his days at home, still on paid administrative leave. The once proud officer now avoided public places, tired of the whispers and stares. His wife Karen had taken a part-time job to help with expenses, unsure about their future. At the police department, changes were already visible. New training programs emphasized de-escalation techniques. Community engagement became a priority, with officers required to spend time each week meeting residents in non-enforcement situations. Sarah Martinez, the officer who had supported Marcus's campaign, now led these community initiatives. "We're seeing real progress," she reported during a staff meeting. "People are starting to trust us again." One afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Karen Wilson had requested a meeting, and despite his staff's reservations, he agreed to see her. "Mr. Mayor," she began, sitting nervously in front of his desk. "I know my husband made mistakes, serious ones, but he's not the same person anymore. These past months have changed him." Marcus listened carefully, remembering their brief encounter during the campaign. "Mrs. Wilson, I appreciate you coming here, but you understand this isn't personal. We have to follow the evidence and the law." Karen nodded, wiping away tears. "He wants to apologize to you. In person. Would you allow that?" The request surprised Marcus. After consulting with his team, he agreed to a meeting, which would be held in the mayor's office with others present. The following week, James Wilson entered City Hall for the first time since the election. He looked smaller somehow, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes. Chief Martinez and the city attorney joined Marcus in his office. "Mayor Thompson," Wilson began, his voice barely steady, "I've had a lot of time to think. About that day at the rally, about all the other days when I abused my authority. I was wrong, not just about arresting you, but about how I viewed my role as an officer." Marcus watched the man who had once handcuffed him now struggling to maintain composure. "I'm not asking to keep my job," Wilson continued. "I know that's not possible. I just wanted you to know that your victory, your leadership, it's helped me see things differently." The room fell silent after Wilson finished speaking. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city he now led. "Thank you for coming today," he finally said, turning back to Wilson. "Your acknowledgement means something. But you're right. We can't ignore the record of misconduct. The city attorney will contact you about the formal termination process." Wilson nodded, understanding this was the end of his police career. As he stood to leave, Marcus added one final thought. "Officer Wilson, redemption doesn't end with admission of mistakes. There are community organizations that work with former law enforcement to improve police-community relations. Think about it." After Wilson left, Chief Martinez stayed behind. "That couldn't have been easy for either of you," she observed. "No," Marcus agreed, "but necessary. For him, for the department, and for our city." Later that evening, as Marcus prepared to leave the office, he found a small group of children waiting outside City Hall. They were from the community center near where he'd been arrested. "Mr. Mayor," they called out, "can we take a picture with you?" As he posed with the children, Marcus noticed Officer Sarah Martinez walking her beat nearby. She waved, and several of the children waved back, calling her by name. It was a small moment, but it represented everything he'd hoped to achieve. A city where law enforcement and community could interact with trust and respect. The sun set over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the city streets. Change was happening, slowly but surely, Tomorrow would bring the official announcement of Wilson's termination, but tonight, hope continued to grow in the hearts of its citizens. The morning headlines read, Mayor Thompson announces major police department changes. Marcus sat in his office, reviewing the press release one final time before his scheduled press conference. The statement was firm but fair, focusing on systemic changes rather than personal vengeance. At exactly 10 a.m., he stepped up to the podium in the City Hall press room. Cameras flashed as reporters filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. This was the moment Millbrook had been waiting for. Today marks not an ending, but a beginning, Marcus began, his voice clear and strong. The termination of one officer is not our goal. Our goal is the transformation of an entire system. He outlined the changes already implemented. New training programs, community oversight boards, and transparent complaint procedures. The reporters scribbled furiously as he spoke, knowing this would be a historic day for Millbrook. Across town, James Wilson watched the press conference on his living room TV. Karen sat beside him, holding his hand as Marcus announced the official end of Wilson's law enforcement career. We wish Mr. Wilson well in his future endeavors, Marcus said on screen, maintaining professionalism even in this moment. And we hope he will find ways to contribute positively to our community's healing process. After the press conference, Marcus met with his senior staff. Chief Martinez presented the latest statistics. Complaints against officers were down 40%, while community engagement had increased significantly. The Wilson case sent a clear message, she reported. Officers understand now that accountability isn't just a word, it's a reality. Later that afternoon, Marcus visited the community center where he once run youth programs. The same children who had witnessed his arrest now greeted him with huge smiles and excited waves. Look, Mayor Thompson, one young girl called out, pointing to a new mural on the wall. It showed diverse hands joined together, including one holding a police badge and another holding a community leader's megaphone. As Marcus admired the artwork, he noticed a familiar figure in the doorway. James Wilson stood there, not in his usual uniform, but wearing casual clothes and a volunteer badge. The community center director suggested I might help with their youth mentoring program. Wilson explained quietly, share my experiences, help kids understand both sides of the badge. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. This was exactly the kind of transformation he'd hoped to see, not just institutional change, but personal growth. It's a good start, he replied, extending his hand. Wilson shook it, and several kids watched the exchange with wide eyes. That evening, local news crews filmed as new recruits graduated from the police academy. Their class was the most diverse in the city's history, and their training had included extensive community engagement and de-escalation techniques. Marcus gave the commencement speech, standing before the fresh-faced officers in their crisp uniforms. Your badge is not a shield from accountability, he told them. It's a symbol of your commitment to serve and protect all citizens equally. Wear it with honor, humility, and wisdom. After the ceremony, Officer Sarah Martinez approached the mayor with exciting news. Community trust scores had reached their highest levels in department history. People are starting to see us as guardians again, she said, beaming, not warriors. Back in his office, Marcus looked at two framed photos on his wall. One showed him being arrested by Wilson at the rally. The other showed him taking the oath of office as mayor. Between them hung the city's new mission statement: justice, unity, progress. As the sun set on Millbrook, Marcus stood at his office window, watching the city come alive with evening activity. Police officers chatted with street vendors, community members gathered for neighborhood watch meetings, and children played freely in parks that had once been considered unsafe. His phone buzzed with a message from Angela. Mom would be so proud of you. Marcus smiled, remembering his mother's words about turning obstacles into opportunities. The arrest that could have sparked division had instead catalyzed unity. The officer who had once represented the problem had become part of the solution. Outside, a police car rolled slowly past City Hall. The officer inside waved to a group of teenagers, who waved back without hesitation. It was a small gesture, but it represented everything Marcus had fought for: a city where trust replaced fear, where accountability fostered respect, and where justice meant more than just punishment. Millbrook had changed, and with it, its people had changed too. The story that began with an arrest had ended with transformation, not just of a police department or a city government, but of hearts and minds. And that, Marcus knew, was the greatest victory of all.